Hello, welcome to your virtual visit with the Tenement Museum. My name is Dolan.
And I'm Grace.
We're so glad that you can join us here. We are going to get started with the program properly in just a minute or so. In the meantime, we'd love to know where everyone is visiting from. It's one of my favorite things about these virtual programs is that we get people from all over the world, all over the country. So please add in the chat where you're joining from tonight or today, wherever you're from, whatever time zone. Really quickly, just a little bit of business. We are so happy to provide these free programs. We do ask, if you are able, please consider making a small tax-deductible donation. It allows us to continue to do these programs and all kinds of other great programming here at the Tenement Museum. I also want to say we are not the only people here in this program. We are joined by Kat, who is managing the chat. And she's going to be there the whole time to answer any questions you have, to address any technical issues if they come up. And we do want to hear from you. So please add your own questions for Grace and myself, and Kat will pass them along throughout the program and during a brief Q&A session at the end. So like all of our programs on site or virtual, we really want to hear from you. Visiting from this evening.
We're having one little technical difficulty. You're hearing double audio? Repeat audio.
Okay.
We're going to pause for a moment. So, let's see. Is that mic still on? Let's have you guys keep going. Is that mic still on?
Yeah, it's one of the mics still on.
There shouldn't be anything. So let's have you guys keep going.
Okay.
We're going to keep going.
We're going to keep going, and hopefully that solved some of the audio issues. So if you are joining us for the first time, a little bit about our institution. We were founded in 1988 with the discovery of the building we are in right now. We have been preserving and reinterpreting the spaces within 97 Orchard, this tenement that was originally built in 1863. We're all good? All right. And occupied for 72 years until 1935. So we decided to take a very different approach to a historic house museum and tell the story, not of the rich and famous and powerful, but really focus on recreating the everyday lives and lived experiences of the working class immigrants, migrants, and refugees who overwhelmingly called buildings like ours and this neighborhood over its history home. And this special Valentine's Day tour is really focusing in on an aspect of everyday life and experience that is very essential, fundamental, but for us historians, a little bit harder to access. So Grace, I'm going to pass it off to you to really begin the program properly.
Oh, thank you so much. Begin it properly. I do have to say I love this program. It's one very near and dear to my heart. A question I have for all of you, and please feel free to share your answers in the chat, is where can we find love on the historic record? Right? Often historians look to things like census records, marriage records, which can tell us about family situations, right? But that kind of feeling of love. And as you're putting your responses in the chat in just a moment, you'll see an image that I always love using on this program.
Yeah, you actually found this image and introduced it to the program, right?
I did.
Yes.
According to some, to many, the Greeks have at least 8 different words for love. Mm-hmm. We have eros, that kind of romantic love. We have storge, family love. Agape, kind of a selfless or all-encompassing love. And even maybe some of the, what might seem a bit darker versions of love, like mania, right? And so as we go through this program, I encourage you to think about all the different kinds of love that exist and how it's not static and it can change over time, definitely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just curious, were there any respondents in the chat?
From Sherry, we've got newspaper stories.
Absolutely.
Nora says letters.
Letters, great.
We're going to come back to letters later.
Yeah, it's one of those sources that I wish we really had more of. But
Absolutely.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay, so I think we're going to go ahead and get started. And we're going to really start this program kind of in the middle of the building's life as a place where people lived. So we're looking at the 1900s, 19-teens. And we're going to start with the story of the Rogoszewski family. They lived for quite a while, actually, in this apartment that we are actually joining you from on the 3rd floor. This was a family of Lithuanian immigrants, and I'm going to pull up a picture of them really quickly. All right, so we have 3 photos that were actually provided to us by the descendants of the family, and that's really our main resource. We do have a lot of documents that tell the story of this family's time in the building, but we were lucky enough to actually speak to them themselves. So we have an image of Fanny surrounded by some of her kids, so Fanny and Abraham, and those are the 2 individual portraits that you see next to the family photo. That family photo, by the way, very important to the museum. It was taken in front of our building, so actually that photo helped us recreate some elements of the stoop that had been lost over time. And it's just Fanny, her daughter, a couple of her sons, and a couple random children in that photograph. While they lived in this building, it was a family of 8. And I want you to really kind of keep that in mind as we start getting into dating and romance and ideas of these concepts in the 1900s. 3-room apartments, 325 square feet. Mom, dad, 2 daughters, Bessie and Ida, 4 sons, Sam, Philip, Henry, and Morris. And if that weren't enough, in the early 19-teens, they have a 9th person living with them. Like over half of the neighborhood, they would have taken in a boarder for some period of time. So this is someone who's paying a little bit of the rent, maybe sleeping in the corner, getting a meal that Fanny's making for her children. And while they were living in our building, the neighborhood is at its densest. There could be 2,000 to 3,000 people per block. This building alone in 1910 had about 112 residents. And the neighborhood is changing. This is the peak of the neighborhood's period of time when it is largely Eastern European. Would have been the largest Jewish population center in the world, and likely the most densely packed area in the world, the most densely populated area in the world. And the 1900s, it's a time of tremendous change, not just for families like the Rogoszewskis, but everyone in the United States. The progressive era brings massive social, political, and economic changes, and that's going to lead to a lot of cultural changes as well. And so I'm going to pass it back to you just to kind of talk about how Bessie and Ida, who would have been about 17, 18, 18, 19 in 1911, 1912, what is the culture around romance that they are inhabiting?
Short answer, it's shifting, right? So even going back a little bit further to the 1900 census, we see that many Jewish immigrants in the Lower East Side tended to marry young. Harris and Jenny Levine, for example, another family who lived in this building that we talk about at this museum, came here as newlyweds from Eastern Europe, raised their 5 children here, but also for families like the Rogoszewskis, where we have some older children who made that journey here too. It's going to be a lot of navigation between their parents' customs and traditions versus New York City customs and traditions, and that definitely relates to courtship and marriage, right? In Eastern Europe, it was far more common to see families getting a matchmaker or a shakin, right? They would pay for this service, which we'll talk about a little bit, to make a match. This matchmaker typically would be approached by a bride's family, or a soon-to-be bride's family, who then would kind of assess the groom's looks, education, earning potential, family, right? And try to match people based on that. Typically, then, if that was successful, they would get about 10% of the dowry. If the groom's family or the groom didn't produce 10% of the dowry, then all of a sudden there was a more attractive, more educated option available for the bride, right? In New York City, around this time period, that's really shifting away. In just a moment, you'll see an article published in 1900 in the New York Tribune called Jews Wed Without Brokers, right? That matchmakers or shadchans find business bad and deplore the unhappiness sure to follow. This was a matchmaker on Hester Street, not too far away from where we are here. And this service had already started to shift in that it wasn't the more straightforward matchmaking as it had been in many places in Eastern Europe, but it also, his business advertised things like English lessons, translation services, like really trying to tap as much of the market that he could in places like the Lower East Side. So probably a lot of tensions between generations. People are meeting others elsewhere, right? But there is a quote that I want to briefly quote from this article that I find very interesting from this matchmaker on Hester Street. "I would starve to death in a month if I depended on matchmaking for a living. Once I lived on the fat of the land, and most of the marriageable young men and women in the quarter depended on me to make them happy for life. Now they believe in love and all that rot. They're making their own marriages, and many of them will be unhappy. They've learned how to start their own love affairs from the Americans, and it's one of the worst things they have picked up." It goes on to say, essentially, "I'm sure and I hope things will go back to the old way, and for their own sakes and my own." So a really interesting glimpse into the shifting culture, right? So where were teens like Bessie and Ida interacting with others? This was another period of change in the sense that by 1920, it's really the first time in the United States that there were more people living in cities than in towns. You had a lot of teenage girls like Bessie and Ida working at a youngish age, right? 14 and up, in factories, for example, like Bessie working in a garment factory, making shirtwaists or blouses. There's also more places like dance halls and parks and cafes that they're interacting with other people their age, hearing about different forms of media, which we're going to talk about in a moment. But it's really going to shift the landscape, especially when we consider in this 325 square foot apartment with 9 people, it kind of flips the idea of intimate courtship on its head. That in some ways, the outside world becomes a bit more intimate than your home or family space.
Yeah, absolutely. It's such an interesting time, all these things you said. I think about how, right, families like the Rogoshevskys, they might need their daughters to work a few more extra years before they get married, and that's changing the culture. Bessie and Ida would have been working at factories, but giving most of their money to mom and dad, but that little bit that they get to keep, they get to save up, and they get to go to cafes, or theaters, or movie theaters, or Coney Island. Absolutely, so there's this kind of economic impetus to this cultural change. But I also think about just the explosion in media that they would have had access to. And of course, very soon they are going to be going to the cinemas. They're going to be getting a very idealized version of a romance. But even before that, families who lived in our tenement would have been inundated with very American ideas of what men and women should be in terms of their lives and in terms of their sort of romantic futures through dime novels. And it's actually part of our interpretation of this space because this would have been such a common form of entertainment. So I really like this part of the story. Dime novels, that's kind of a wrong title. It's what very wealthy Americans who saw them as bad influences on culture called them. But they weren't dimes. They were like 2 cents to 5 cents, right? These are just like very wealthy Americans thinking that these are a little too pedestrian. But by the 1900s, a lot of progressive era reformers really thought that they were very influential tools of Americanization to immigrant children who are becoming more literate, who are learning English through our expanded public school system. So they really thought they could teach these foreign kids who are living in cities what it's like to live on the frontier by reading Westerns, and what it's like to be a proper American woman by reading romance novels. Over time, though, the audience itself kind of influences how these stories are written. So rather than stories of proper, wealthy, aristocratic ladies finding their, Prince Charming or whatever, the protagonists become more and more factory girls like Bessie and Ida. Ultimately, though, they will find some rich guy and marry rich and buy the best clothes and things like that. But the story we have, or the book, we have in our apartment here, I think is really interesting because many dime novels that on the surface look like very proper stories for a young lady to read are secretly action and adventure tales. And Magdalena's Vow is one of them. Magdalene's Vow, written by one of the earliest successful women authors in the dime novel presses. May Agnes was her name, but she always went by some kind of usually male pseudonym. But Magdalene's Vow is actually about Magdalene getting revenge on a man who cheated her sister out of her inheritance. So, yeah, a lot of different competing ideas that these young women are receiving even in the home.
And it's also, I find interesting to think about if you're a teenage girl like Bessie or Ida Rogoszewski, maybe your parents don't read English as well.
Mm-hmm.
What can you kind of get away with passing around in these factory spaces or bringing home? How romantic are they? Some young women at the time even would adopt the common kind of protagonists' names as their American name, like Rose was pretty common, I believe. But going back to that idea of where these teens are kind of mingling, right? Even outside of that, we know there was a very common way of courtship and courting for love matches, right? That would happen in very public spaces like Seward Park. Samuel Chatsanoff, who grew up in a tenement in the neighborhood, has this memory, and I'm going to quote him directly because I think it's very funny and telling. Privacy in the home was virtually unknown. The streets in the evening were thick with promenading couples, and the benches around the fountain at Seward Park and in Jackson Street Park, and the empty trucks lined up at the riverfront were filled with lovers who had no other place to meet. Boys of my age were required to be home around 10 at night. Those of us who were still in the streets at that hour might decide perversely to hang around the fountain with the intent of embarrassing the lovers on the benches. We would sneak up behind them and imitate the amorous confidences we imagined they exchanged. I'm sure there was a lot of fake kissy sounds or
oh, absolutely,
that kind of teasing from young boys as well. So an interesting kind of thing, right? It's also happening outside of their parents' watchful gaze, but it also is, in that sense, the more public way. And Seward Park that he referenced opened in 1900. It was the first park in this neighborhood, so I'm sure a very good romantic opportunity for young couples. Another way, though, if we're thinking about ways to court or find love or communicate love, right, in these very densely populated spaces, letters. Someone had mentioned that at the beginning, right? Letter writing.
Right, especially since this was such a huge part of just the dating culture in the United States. You exchanged letters for a while. And there was sort of an expected etiquette and methodology on what you were going to write, how, when, etc. So how would a young immigrant woman like Bessie or Ida learn this aspect of what was expected of them?
Well, and I'm glad that you mentioned the etiquette as well. In just a moment, you're going to see a book called American Letter Writer. This was not only how to write letters, but especially for these newly arriving immigrants who it's not only a shift of language, of etiquette, but also the customs, right? It's not necessarily assumed to be a matchmaking process anymore. And these had letters or like kind of form or sample letters related to business, to getting an apartment, all sorts of different things, but also love letters. So I know this can be a bit difficult to see. We have here a page in English and in Yiddish on the other side, but we can read. This is the ideal sample form letter for young lovers.
Yeah, so I will read the mail letter, and it even has, responses. So if you receive a letter, you can look through the book to see how you respond. If you're a student, if you're a worker, depending on your situation, depending on how long you've known the person, you can flip through this book and find the proper letter to write. So this is from a young workman to his sweetheart, is that right?
Yes.
So, Dear Tilly, I have long been in love with you, but was afraid to tell you. When I go with you to the theater or park, I am almost like a fool, and altogether unfit for company. I think of you all day, and at night I dream of my Tilly. I am well settled in work, and my wages are $9 a week. You and I can live comfortably on that. I hope, my dear, you will not be angry, for I am really in love. I cannot be happy unless you are mine. I was afraid to mention this to you, but if you will leave an answer at my lodgings, I will meet you next Sunday, after dinner, at the park, when we will take a walk and have some coffee and cake. How happy I shall be to hear from you, but 1,000 times more to think you will be mine.
I will read the sample response from Dear Tilly. My dear Sam, I received your very kind letter. I was anxiously waiting for such words from you, for I love you deeply, although I never plainly showed my love to you. I will be very happy to go with you to the park next Sunday, when we will speak of our future. Your loving Tilly. Which I always get a kick of how short her response letter is, right?
It's like, yeah, sure, got it, yeah.
So who knows then what the following conversation in the park would be for Tilly and Sam. But this was really aimed at the newly arriving Jewish immigrants in places like the Lower East Side.
Right, and so we are going now to bring up a video of Lana, our colleague, who's going to talk about some of the actual physical evidence around romance and dating and, the culture of it all that we actually discovered in our building. Okay.
Hi, I'm Lana Dubin, the collections manager here at the Tenement Museum. I'm standing in the front entrance of 97 Orchard in front of the historic mailboxes. When our founders rediscovered the building in 1988, these mailboxes still had the family names of the residents who had last lived here in 1935.
We also found letters, advertisements, movie theater tickets, and overdue library book notices in these mailboxes. Some of the items that we found in the mailboxes indicate that tenement dwellers were looking for love, just like we do today. One of these items is instructions for finger weaving, and we believe this is associated with one of the young women who lived in the building in the 1930s, who had many advertisements for ways to cosmetically improve her appearance in the mailbox. These instructions are detailed and show the latest fashion hairstyles for young women at the time. Another item is for a word to young folks from 15 to 21 years of age, your future and what your parents owe to you. And this is for a brand of skin cream that's to promote youthfulness and brightness. And on the back, they have hundreds of unsolicited testimonials with full addresses on file and an image of a young couple who is wedded, presumably because the bride has used this cosmetic product. Finally, just around the corner on Delancey Street, there was a ring appraisal. So we have all of the stages leading to that eventual engagement here found in the mailboxes in the Tenement Museum. During the summer of 2023, while the Tenement Museum was in the depths of our most recent construction project, we found this beautiful wedding invitation in the 5th floor. This wedding invitation is in both English and Yiddish and advertises a reception in a tenement really close to this one, and it's on the top floor, meaning that the residents all would have combined their apartments for a giant floor-wide wedding reception. I am holding perhaps the most intimate object in the Tenement Museum's collection. This handwritten love letter was found in our mailboxes in 1993 and shows one person writing their love out to another. We've placed this love letter in a Melanex sleeve so that the words that one lover wrote to another will forever be preserved in the Tenement Museum's collection.
All right, so let's delve into this letter that was discovered in a little bit more depth. It's one of my favorite items that we've found in our building and have in our collections. So I'm going to pull it up so we can see. And Grace, if you want to read out, it is a little bit kind of broken at the end, so we don't know everything that it says. And you can tell me what you think, but I don't think he used the letter writing guide to write this one.
It doesn't sound like Sam from the
yeah.
letter writer. Yeah, we have to fill in a little bit of the blanks, and we don't know who wrote this, who it was intended for, whether anything came of it, but let's see if we can figure it out together. The seat of my pants, hot where lovely papa left of his brogans, but love laughs. Nobody can keep us apart, for love, I think, never dies, does it, dear? Saturday I'll give the usual whistle, pack, suitcase, and we'll elope and be married. The Rolls Rough will be up for the occasion, and we'll a bully time. And it's signed your own onlyest. Now, just to clarify a couple of things, Brogan is boot, right? So presumably Papa was kicking him out at some point. And we think that Rolls Rough is likely a play on Rolls Royce, which was a company started in 1906. So maybe it's like his car not fancy so bad, car. Yeah, it's a hoopty, right?
Okay. Well, I think this is a nice time to pause just to see if there are any questions or responses before we bring it back to the story of the Rogoshevsky family.
Tessa was sharing that she just loves seeing the penmanship
me
from
too.
this time period.
Me too.
And then we had Tessa and another viewer just wondering about the stories of Italians or Irish immigrants finding love in the tenements. So a lot of curiosity and excitement for the ways that tenements foster connections.
Yeah, and I think if this was up to Grace, it would be a 3-hour program.
It sure would.
Yeah.
I have lots
absolutely.
of stories.
Yeah. We are going to jump around a little bit to some different stories, but I will, kind of bring in a story of the Italian family that end up being the Rogoshevsky's neighbors in just a moment. Yeah. Bessie, Ida, teenage girls in this like shifting culture in the United States about romance, kind of shifting roles of women in the economy and in society. But it turns out she didn't have very far to look to find her future husband. So who did Bessie end up marrying, Grace?
The border! It's one of my favorite imagined scandalous details. There were some articles written about the borders and how common they were in this neighborhood, that sometimes it would cause strife within families or sometimes might be a temptation for housewives like Fanny, but it wasn't Fanny's story. It was Bessie's. She and the border get married. I tend to prefer the version that it's like, shock, this man that we let stay with our family now is marrying our daughter. It also is probably a little bit of, well, they knew him well and could approve of him as a match.
Right. They might have even encouraged it a little, maybe.
Could be.
Who knows,
Could
right?
be. Bessie sleeping right through the window here in the kitchen with her sister, and the border here in the parlor with her brothers. But it happens. Oh. Right? So Barney Cohen and Bessie get married.
Yeah, so they're going to get married in 1912. And they'll have 3 kids. We got to speak to some of them who kind of shared some details about their own story, although I think they themselves never heard from their mother how scandalous or unscandalous their relationship was.
Although one of their sons, and if you want to pull up a photo of Bessie and her
we
3
do have a
kids,
picture of her and her kids here.
One of her children, Irving, did tell us to the effect, my father sold pots and pans, he was a boarder by my grandmother, and fell in love with my mother, right? So he describes it certainly as a love match.
Yeah. They move across the street after they get married. They start a family. They move up to the Bronx. And he actually is a fairly successful businessman in the way that the family tells the story. Unfortunately, tragedy does strike 12 years later, where he will very suddenly die, leaving Bessie alone to raise her kids. And I have a quote from Irving, his son, who describes this event. He says, "My father died when he was 38. He was a very successful businessman. We lived all those years in the Bronx. And one day we went to Coney Island and he had an attack." And so there's actually appendicitis, I believe, right?
That's right.
We had to take the taxi all the way home to the Bronx. And I remember that night my mother came home and she was crying. She was crying for her orphans. What are you going to do? She never would remarry. She didn't want a stepfather for her children. She was a beautiful woman, my mother, beautiful woman, never wanted a stepfather. And then he goes on to describe how the money that Barney left behind allowed Bessie actually to invest in a camp up in the Catskills that she ran with other family members for many, many years. And then speaking to these different forms of love, the Great Depression hits. Like many people, they kind of lose their savings, they lose their business. And so she actually turns to family and the community of the building. She'll move back into this building in 1929. And we get really wonderful stories from Irving about the kind of love between the families. About half the building was Eastern European, half Italian. And in particular, the neighbors across the hall, the Baldizzi family, who would watch Bessie's kids, would take care of them, who introduced them to Italian food. So again, I think this really great way that we can see different kinds of love in the sort of memories of the community of the building.
Absolutely. And I think it's also interesting to think about the different perspectives involved, right? Would Bessie herself say that she never wanted to remarry? I don't know. This is Irving remembering his parents, right? From his own kind of as a child perspective in that way too. But I also think not only the love of the building and the community, but even, Bessie moves back in with her mom. Adolfo Baldizzi teaches Irving how to shave, right, when he got old enough. We have remembrances from the Baldizzi family about the Rogoshevsky family. And so these different ways and aspects of love, and again, how it might change over time or throughout relationships.
Absolutely. So we're very lucky that we got to talk to this family and see photographs and hear memories. But what happens when you go farther back in the past, right, where we don't get those resources? I think, we have to, as public historians, get a little bit more creative with how we look for or interpret the relationship between two people. So I want to pull all the way back to the early years of 97 Orchard, and at this point in time, the building had just been built in 1863, and 1860s into the 1870s, the first tenements on the Lower East Side were being constructed by the first large-scale non-English speaking immigrant enclave in New York, which would have been the Germans. So by 1870, buildings like ours, built by Germans to house German immigrants, would have meant that this neighborhood was called Klein Deutschland, Little Germany. And in 1870, it really would have been a new phenomenon in New York and in American cities, right? This densely packed, non-English speaking foreign enclave. And so we have multiple tours that kind of tell the story of some of our early families that lived in the Klein Deutschland period. But one of the families that we have a lot of text references about, we have a lot of documents about, We're actually the first family that ran the business in the basement space of 97 Orchard. And we have a recreation of what that business would have looked like that I'll pull up here. So in case you can't tell, it is a bar, it is a saloon, but not just any saloon, it is a German-style lager beer hall. The Germans come to the U.S. really missing their drinking culture, which would have been fun and family-friendly and festive and full of music and food, and I think very important for our topic tonight, romance and dating. Would have been a place where men and women were permitted to kind of mingle, very much unlike American saloons and bars at the time. And so we do see in the 1870 census, John and Caroline Schneider, two German immigrants, are running this saloon, and they're going to run it for quite some time. And because they are here for so long, we have a lot of different records that can kind of speak to them as individuals and as a couple. So Grace, I'll let you start with the Schneiders.
I love the Schneiders. Okay, so I'm going to back up a little bit to talk about their journey getting to New York City and the Lower East Side, or Klein Deutschland. John comes to New York City first with his family. He comes in 1842. He's 12 years old. When he first was living here, he was living uptown with his parents, with his family. As he got older, he was working as a shoemaker, like how his father was a shoemaker, and likely his grandfather was a shoemaker. I don't get the sense he was very passionate about it, but John was also a musician. So maybe he's doing kind of the family business, maybe playing music on the side, until he enlists in the Civil War. Which is another whole rabbit hole I can go down. He winds up serving in the New York 8th Infantry. Is that right? So that's kind of his journey up to coming to 97 Orchard Street. A little bit about Caroline. She comes to New York when she's 14 years old from Prussia. She comes a couple years later, 1849. Am I doing my math correctly? Something like 1847.
1847.
Thank you, math. And we don't know a whole lot about her until we see these documents with her and John together. They get married pretty shortly after John gets out of his service during the Civil War. In a moment, you'll be able to see a bit of their marriage record that we have. They get married in St. Matthew's Lutheran Church. So that's pictured here on the left. And their marriage is unique in several ways. John specifically was from a place that by that point was Bavaria. Something interesting to note, this neighborhood gets the nickname Little Germany before Germany was unified. It doesn't become Germany until 1871. Prior to that, we have about 39 different city-states. So Prussia, Bavaria, Baden, with different dialects, different foods, different traditions, different religions even, right? A lot of very particular regional differences. And I say that because John's coming from Bavaria, specifically a town called Burgpropach, right? Caroline's coming from Prussia or Westphalia, right? Lots of shifting borders at this time period. And in Germany, but also even in New York, you didn't see a whole lot of Prussians and Bavarians getting married, right? Again, that trend continues even for people like John and Caroline in New York City, with about 70 to 75% of Bavarians marrying other Bavarians and Prussians, other Prussians. If you take that a bit more wider to the region of what is now Germany, it's more like 90% in New York City, right? So this is already rather remarkable in that sense, especially given all these different barriers. Another thing I sometimes wonder about on this marriage record, John's parents, who we also have quite a bit of documentation about, are not the witnesses. I do wonder if maybe there was some tension or disapproval there. Maybe not, I hope not. But they also get married a bit slightly older than the average age that people were getting married in this neighborhood at the time. I wonder if John's time in the Civil War had something to do with that maybe they were kind of courting, had this experience from both perspectives, and thought maybe these things don't matter quite as much as we thought they did before. But they get married 1863, and about a year later, open up a saloon together. I often like to ask visitors, right, imagine if anyone is married or knows a married person, what might prompt you to, within a year of getting married, open up a business with your spouse? And I think there are long-term reasons for that. Sorry, we're about to...
Well, yeah, just, no, exactly like you said. I often think about what it might have been like if they were courting before he enlists, what that does to the kind of texture of their relationship. Were they writing letters back and forth? And yeah, how many spouses can work together even? What does that say about their relationship? And also the fact that it doesn't seem to me like either of them have any experience in saloons.
He was a shoemaker, right? Unlikely that she was running a saloon before they got married. And it's also one of those things where maybe it is long term, so they can have financial stability, raise a family, right? Have their own situation. Short term, it's going to take all of their time, all of their money, especially given that there were over 700 other saloons in this neighborhood alone at the time. It's very competitive, right? So also maybe there's an aspect of, if we're a couple with this business, we might invite men, women, and children and make it a family space, become a community space, get food, advice, legal advice even, newspapers in English and German, right? And I think, in my mind, they did that because they had their business in 97. They lived right behind it in 97 Orchard for over 20 years.
Right. It's the longest running business in our building's history. And the success or failure of these businesses was really dependent on the couple who ran it, right? Their personality, the kind of community that they fostered, the food that Caroline made.
And we do know that by 1880, they have a 3-year-old son named Henry, or Harry, he's sometimes referred to. So they do have also a toddler running around the space. It's going to be open long hours, long days, but again, providing services for the community, but also I think kind of embodying what I imagine would be the strength of their relationship. And this lasts until 1885, when Caroline passes away from tuberculosis. When she dies, John puts an obituary, essentially, or a notice in the newspaper, the Stadtzeitung, which was a German language newspaper at the time in New York City. And in a moment, we'll be able to see what it says. So the original is on top, the translation at the bottom. Relatives, friends, and acquaintances, also some of the fraternal organizations John was a part of. The sad news that my dear wife Caroline Schneider, born Dietman, 50 years old, on the 6th of June at 7 in the morning, after a difficult suffering, fell gently asleep. The burial will be Monday the 8th at 2 o'clock in the afternoon from the Mourning House, number 97 Orchard. Signed, the mourning husband, John Schneider. Which not everyone got this kind of published obituary at the time, certainly. I think the language is also rather telling.
I agree. I think, we really don't necessarily, in the documents we have for this woman, get a sense of her personality, get a sense of her relationship. But I think the fact that they ran this business together for so long, that it was clearly successful, that there is this, very mournful announcement.
And then he calls it not a saloon. He says, on this day, it's a mourning house. And not only that, he commissions this gravestone to be built for her. You can see on the right. It's the tallest in the plot by far. It's much taller than I am, in fact.
Yeah, it is the only member of the Schneider family. She's the only member of the Schneider family who has her own individual monument. And that is not a common thing we see for women at the time. So again, I think we can see in other elements of their story who she was, how they felt about each other, and what her loss meant to John and to the community.
And to the community, right? Which I think in a moment it will be clear. I also think quite a lot about that kind of impact and how far it reaches. Because several years ago, I was at All Faith Lutheran Cemetery, which is where she's buried. I thought, what if I could find Caroline Schneider's gravestone? And I did. So the picture on the left, this was years ago, did find it. Some kind of spidey sense, I think, took me kind of straight to it. And it was completely overgrown, right? It's hard to tell in that photo, but there was grass and weeds up to my knees, outside of the ivy even, which then led to, in October of 2021, I believe, Dolan, myself, and a former colleague of ours, Danielle, went back to clear it off, right? So that kind of love's still extending
Just
that way.
a little bit of a growing tradition among tenement museum educators, visiting and tending to the graves of the people whose stories that we narrate. So, which I think is probably, the Greeks have a name of love for that, probably.
If not,
Yeah.
the Germans might
Yeah.
also. But just to kind of wrap up a bit of the Schneider story, shortly after Caroline passes, John also passes away. The saloon had closed. And when that happened, their son, Henry, was about 14, almost 15 years old. So the last document I want to show you all was John's brother, George, formally adopting Henry Schneider, which I also find interesting, not only because he was getting to an age where he could probably start working, maybe wouldn't need that type of legal guardianship, being almost 15, but it also tells us that Henry Schneider's entire estate, after both his parents passed, was about $44. So I think certainly losing Caroline and the business very much impacting that. To formally adopt Henry or Harry Schneider, Uncle George had to pay $88, which I think is another way of this kind of looking at historic documents to see about relationships and different kinds of care and love.
Absolutely. And so we just have one more story that we're going to kind of share briefly, because it's going to bring us from this idea of, kind of the businesses of the building as being more than just a place to make money. And it's going to bring us really into the present day. So I just want to pull up one more picture. This is Max Marcus, and he would have been a neighbor of the Rogoshevskys. He ran an auction house down in the basement in the 1930s. He was born right across the street, and apparently he had a rough childhood, according to his own kind of self-narration in an interview that was done in the 1980s. His mom was very worried. He was getting in fights. He was skipping school.
Skipping his music lessons.
Skipping his music lessons, climbing out fire escapes. He was in like 2nd or 3rd grade, but she was very convinced that he was destined for a life of crime. So she convinces her good friend Willie Scher, who ran a business across the street, to take him in as an apprentice. And he works for Willie for many, many years until Willie retires and basically gives him the business. So I do love this picture. You can see how crowded his auction house is. That's him with a mustache smiling at the camera. And this is during the Depression when this photo was taken, so he's clearly got a kind of business sense. And this is going to take him throughout the history of the neighborhood. Starts in a business in the 1920s, and he's still in business in the 80s, right? He is going to move into the New Essex market and run different kinds of businesses. He's always kind of one step ahead of the changes that occur. But he has a really interesting kind of romantic story. So this next image is him and Pauline Bloom.
So although it seemed as a young child, maybe he was disobedient in certain ways, as an adult, maybe he was a bit disobedient in others, because Max had actually been forbidden to marry Pauline until Max's older sister got married. And
Mhm.
so they eloped.
Yep, did not
We
wait for his older
did not wait.
sister. Yep.
And were married for 41 years during a time of, again, great transition, business-wise, demographic-wise, infrastructure-wise in the Lower East Side.
Mm-hmm. So she passes away in 1971, and, you know, about 10 or so years later, he is looking to open a new business in the market. He knows that most of the residents at this point are Puerto Rican or from Latin America and the Caribbean. And so he finds a woman named Luisa Orta, and together they open a Botanica, which is a store that sells candles and, you know, religious items. That would have been a very, very popular business in the neighborhood at the time. And the two of them not only form a business partnership, but seem to have also formed a romantic connection. So here's the two of them in the late 1980s outside their store together. And not only do we have interviews from him, because he was kind of a local character, he was considered the mayor of the Essex Street Market for a very long time. We also got the really wonderful opportunity to talk to her, or to talk to his granddaughter, who shared stories about him.
And it's interesting because, yes, they had this business together. His granddaughter said, yeah, they wore wedding rings, but I think that was just for the optics of it. They lived together, but I don't think they were married. She said Max would also say, why would I need to get married? I was already married to the most wonderful person. But again, they did live together, right? They would visit Puerto Rico to see Luisa's family and home.
And bring the grandkids on trips.
And bring the grandkids, right? And run this Botanica in Essex Street Market.
Right, and so we are going to transition
Maybe
now.
more of a companionship type of love.
Possibly. Yeah. Yes, even some ambiguity there with the grandkids recalling it to us. We're going to transition in just a moment to our Q&A, but before we do, we are going to play a video, and I probably won't play the full thing, it's a little long, but it is another story of love and a story of a partnership that saw a successful business in the market. So this is actually Ira, who was a neighbor of the Botanica in the market and knew Max Marcus for many, many years. So he's going to describe running his business with his father and his partner.
Hey, I'm Ira Stolzenberg. We're in the Essex Street Market. We've been here for about 38 years, my partner and I. So we work together 7 days a week. We sleep together every night. We have a house policy, is that you fight during the day and you cannot go to bed angry. So the fight can't go on to the next day. So you can fight all day, at night you have to make up. So I had gotten a job in Las Vegas dealing cards.
Yeah. Really, really love listening to Ira tell his stories. He has a lot of really wonderful stories about the market and how the customers have changed over the years. But something
and if we skip to the end, actually, we can pull back up an image of Ira and his partner, Ronnie.
At the end of the video.
At the end of the video.
Yeah. His father buys him a fish stand in the market, and then he starts running the fish stand with Ronnie, his partner, who kept coming up with these new ideas, like a juice bar and all these things that Ira was convinced could never work. You can't have a fish stand, a bakery, and a juice bar all together. But he said every single time he listened to his partner, the money doubled the following year. So, again.
And that, again, it was kind of, they were romantic partners and business partners, but having somewhat of a separation, but clearly a strength through that as well. And they worked together for 40 years.
40 years. Ronnie unfortunately passed away, but there's still this really large mural on the outside of the market dedicated to him. So in the last few minutes we just want to turn it over to you if you have any questions for us that we can answer.
So overall, we just have a lot of love for the Tenement Museum educators who are tending to the graves of the residents that we talk about. But we do have a question, just inspired by Ira and his partner Ronnie, of just like curiosity about LGBTQ relationships within the tenements, and if we have any evidence of that.
Absolutely.
As hard as it is to find love as historians, it's even harder with queer stories too. So.
Yeah, and we will encourage you in June to rejoin us for our queer history tour that we've done for the past couple of years. It's really interesting, like you said, finding the texture and dimensions of people's romantic lives or their interior worlds. It's difficult, especially the farther back you get, and especially if this was a kind of relationship that was really frowned upon, to put it mildly, or even considered something illegal or medically wrong. But interestingly enough, queer lives were much more visible in working class communities in their time, and to a degree much more understood and accepted. So just really quickly, we know that there were communities of gay men and women who would have balls and dances. We know that there were what we would consider drag bars very close to here on the Bowery. And we even hear from people who
Even
lived in our building.
When the Schneiders were open and operating.
Oh, yes, yes. We even know that in the 1930s, which was a time period of increased surveillance and repression of queer lives, there was a gay couple that lived in our building that everybody knew were a couple, right? So again, it's really interesting, the kind of disadvantage in some ways, but advantage to the kind of histories that we tell, in terms of what was visible, what was known, what was acknowledged, but not necessarily recorded.
Yeah, there also was a case early on in our building's history of the first Essex market that had a court of that related to cross-dressing, essentially, and living as a man. That was brought there even. Yeah, so very much in the neighborhood.
Absolutely. Yeah, any other questions?
I think those are all of our questions for now, but a lot of appreciation for you two and the stories tonight. So we'll pass it back to you for conclusion.
Well, thank you all so much. Happy Valentine's Day. Again, we hope to see you in our future virtual programs and on site if you are in the city. And thank you all so much.
Thank you all. Had a lovely time.